Hi there, my name is Mr. Lamb. I'm Deputy Head at Wallingford School. This is a short recording specifically for parents and carers of our students, all about revision. So we've spoken to students quite a lot in the recent weeks about revision and different strategies they can use, and we think it would be really helpful if parents and carers have also had that information so they can support at home. There are 5 things I'm going to present, same 5 things that we spoke to students about. So there's spacing, chunking, quizzing, elaboration, and exam application. So first one, spacing. We talk to students about the way in which they revise and the idea that actually it's not effective if they just spend hours and hours on one topic or one subject without any breaks at all. And actually it's far, far more effective if they break their revision up into small chunks that are far more manageable and actually provide them with breaks. So on the screen you can see that principle on the illustration. It doesn't have to be half-hour slots. It might be that some students find half an hour works for them, others might find 40 minutes or 50 minutes works for them, but much beyond that, and actually the effectiveness of that revision goes down quite significantly. So we'd strongly encourage students to try and space out their revision. One of the reasons that works is to do with this idea of a forgetting curve. So it's perfectly normal for students to forget things, for all of us to forget things. That's part of how we work. And the idea of spacing is that if we return to topics repeatedly over a series of days, weeks, months, then that information will be lodged more firmly in our long-term memory. So what we want students to do is to return to topics regularly with short breaks in between, rather than just having great big long stints on one topic or one subject area. So we spoke to students about revision timetables. I know lots of students created revision timetables for their half terms and holidays, and we'll continue to support students with that. The sorts of things we encourage are to break things up and to change the times and slots that students are using for different subjects. So for instance, this might be an example on screen of someone who wants to study science, RS, English, various subjects. You'll also spot on there that they're mixed up, but also that they are repeated certain topics. So not just doing the same topic over and over, but obviously mixing it up and returning to some over time. A really useful tool for students to use during this process is a personalised learning checklist, a PLC, or staff might have just given a list of content, and that's really what a PLC is. So it's a list of content, topics, maybe skills as well, that students need to understand and know for any given course. And what we want students to do is, before they start revising, is just reflect on all those topics, ideally to rank them or to colour them red, amber, green, depending on how confident they feel. So green would be a topic that they feel really, really confident on. Amber would be a topic which they know a little bit about, but perhaps need a bit more work. And red would be a topic or even subject where actually they're feeling really underconfident and it's something they definitely need to do more work on. A really key principle for students to try and work to is to focus on their red topics. Okay, so revision should feel quite challenging and quite hard. It shouldn't feel easy. If your son or your daughter is saying, oh, revision's fine, I'm getting everything right, they're probably not revising the right things. They should be revising those red topics, the ones that make them feel challenged and it feels uncomfortable to some extent. So a really important principle, keep focusing on those red topics, those weak areas. So that's our first one, spacing. Second area is chunking, which we spent quite a bit of time with students on. This is the idea that actually if we can group information together, then our brain can recall that information and retrieve it a little bit more easily than if we're trying to have lots and lots of individual bits of information lodged in our brain. So on the left hand side there's sort of 2 ways of thinking about it. One at the top there is thinking about the whole of a course, and actually that can become a bit overwhelming when students come to revise. So it's really helpful to break that down into units, into topics, into sort of subtopics and so on. So one way of thinking about chunking is to sort of break down a big area into smaller chunks. The other way of looking at it is the sort of bottom of that diagram, which is all those little bits of information and key terms and quotes and facts and so on. Actually, that can be overwhelming if we're trying to think about revising all of that and trying to remember all of that separately. So grouping those together chunking those together allows us to remember it a little bit better. Similar principle at the bottom there. We can probably juggle 5 things in our brain, But actually, if we were trying to juggle 25 things, we'd fail. If those 25 things were grouped together into 5 groups or sort of stuck together, then we'd probably be able to manage it. So it's that same principle about chunking things together. When I spoke to students about it, we did a little activity and we asked if one or two students were able to remember these letters, gave them about 10 seconds to have a look at it. And unsurprisingly, that was really challenging to recall these random sets of letters because our brain just can't recall all those little separate bits of information. The exact same letters, when they grouped together, in this case, in obviously 3 animals, became much easier, and students took a second to remember all of those letters just because they were grouped together. So that's what chunking is and the principle behind it. Again, it's really helpful to use a PLC or a list of content to be able to make those groups. And if we're thinking about breaking it down and using things like flashcards, then that's what it might look like. We might have individual flashcards that sort of build up into topic areas or whole units. When we do make flashcards, one of the things we are trying to encourage students to do is make them memorable. So I'm going to give an example, which is actually an A-level topic in A-level sociology, but it's sort of irrelevant. We might have a topic which has loads of information. That's a really poor flashcard on the screen at the moment. The reason it's poor is it's just lots and lots of writing. It's not particularly memorable. It probably won't sort of lodge in our memory particularly well. So we wouldn't encourage students to do that. Instead, the same topic, they might condense some of that information, maybe use some abbreviations, just use those bullet points and hope that actually, or make sure that they can expand on that if they need to. Even better would be some kind of form of diagram. So this one's got a diagram on it. This one's also got color on it. That's going to be a lot more memorable than the one at the top there, which is just lots of writing. So flashcards is one way of chunking material. A second way, really useful technique, is mind maps. So again, I'm sure lots of us are familiar with mind maps, grouping bits of information together. And particularly this diagram on the right provides lots of tips on how to mind map effectively. So things like color, using images, different sizes, different directions, and so on and so on. So anything to make it different and more memorable, not just reams and reams of writing, and certainly not just reading through notes. A third way is acronyms. So things like PLC, our personalized learning checklists. I'm sure lots of us will know what ASAP stands for, as soon as possible. Some of our students use things like PEAL for when they're writing essays, so point, evidence, explain, link. Our English department might well have other acronyms they use for guiding students. I know some of our PE students talk about their components of fitness, which are quite hard to remember, and they've even got an image, some of them, that remind them that it's about power and coordination, reaction time, agility, balance, speed. And again, that's quite a lot of information, but when it's grouped together in an acronym, it becomes a bit more manageable. I'm sure there'll be parents and carers watching that shudder at the sight of this acronym, which is all to do with maths. Some might remember it fondly, but again, we probably all remember that to some extent because it's lodged in our memory. And our French students, I know, are using a term croissant to represent various things when they're looking at how to complete the writing stage in some French lessons. Fourth way is mnemonic, so pretty similar. It's grouping things together. Lots of us will recognize that from colors of the rainbow or points on the compass, and so on and so on. So it's really helpful if, when students are revising, they try and chunk those bits of information together into something memorable. A phrase is really good. And in the exam, what they'll find is they can think of that phrase pretty easily, and that information starts flowing. Finally, diagrams are also really helpful, and that doesn't just have to be, obviously in art or DT. Actually, it could be a geography diagram, it could be a history diagram, a maths diagram. It doesn't really matter, and it doesn't matter what your diagram looks like, as long as it is a bit different from just lots and lots of writing. Again, all of those would be more memorable for students and allow them to recall and retrieve that information a bit better than if it was just writing. So that's the idea of chunking and lots of different techniques. When you are supporting your young person at home, having a look at what they're doing and encouraging them to use those techniques would be really helpful. Third thing we talked to students about was quizzing. So it's all well and good creating revision materials, creating sort of chunked mind maps and diagrams and flashcards and so on. but just creating them doesn't necessarily mean we will remember them better. It'll certainly help, but the really important thing to do is to quiz. Okay, so quizzing is a very, very important part of revising. Okay, actually testing our brain and challenging our brain to see if we can recall that information will end up with the information being lodged in there a little bit more firmly. Okay, and again, it's that same reason. If we don't quiz ourselves, if we just read something once, then the amount of information we retain is quite low after sort of weeks and months. But actually, if we put those boosts in, if we quiz ourselves and regularly test ourselves on that information, then we're more likely to retain it. And again, we've used that phrase boost or booster activities with students, so they should be familiar with that. Quizzing can look like all sorts of things, and in a way it doesn't matter too much as long as students are being sort of tested. What I would say is it needs to be a true test. It's really easy to have a flashcard, to look at it on one side, convince ourselves that we know it, look at the other side and go, yeah, I got that right, I would have got that right. That isn't really a true test. So it does need to be a true test, whatever the type of quizzing students use. So for instance, reading out loud the answer, or maybe someone verbally asking you, maybe even on a piece of paper, writing down the answer without looking at the correct answer first, to see genuinely whether I did know that answer or not. So please make sure when we're quizzing, we're encouraging students to do it honestly and sort of challenging ourselves by doing it that way. Sorts of things they can use are flashcards. There might be a sort of comprehension question. It could be a cue, a sort of recall, cued recall activity where there is some sort of quote to talk about. It could be multiple choice questions. A really effective one when looking at sort of essay plans is to provide the essay question and then ask a student to plan the answer just on a blank piece of paper and see what they could recall, and so on and so on. It really doesn't matter too much what the type of quizzing is as long as it's done regularly. And again, if we went right back to that idea of spacing in between those half an hour or 40-minute or 50-minute sort of periods of revision, I would say at least sort of 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes at the end of each period would be really useful just to do a little bit of quizzing. Fourth thing we talked about was elaboration. This is the idea that, again, information lodges in our memory, sticks in our memory a little bit more firmly, and we're therefore able to recall it better if we really understand it fully, and if we can make connections between information to information that we already have in our brain. So really thinking deeply about topics rather than just trying to memorize keywords or something like that. So the sorts of things that it's helpful to do is to ask questions like, what does this mean? Trying to sort of elaborate on it. Maybe why does it matter? Why does this happen? What would happen if, or so what? What's the impact of that thing, that topic, that idea? Or even how does this relate to something we know already? How does it link to something? So I certainly know students that have got their flashcards with key terms on or key information on, but actually they've got one stack of elaboration cards. And actually they can just pick those at random and then just link them to a topic and try and elaborate. So for instance, drawing something, linking it to something, providing an example of it. How would you explain that to a novice, and so on. But any of those prompts will involve the student thinking a bit more deeply about a topic and therefore understanding it more in more depth. The reason that's so useful is largely that long-term memory part of this diagram. Okay, students will be really familiar with this diagram, the way in which we can sort of get information to stick in our brain. And it's that right-hand side and that word stick that's really helpful. So making links between information, the sort of sticking of information to things that we know already, that's the really important part for making sure that it stays in our memory. Final area that we talked to students about was exam application. So firstly, it's absolutely vital that students understand and know what is coming up in their exam or their assessment. So knowing the length, how many questions, the style of question, the topics involved, which units it covers, and so on. So if they don't already, students absolutely should be questioning teachers and making sure that information is available to them. They need to know that inside out so there are no surprises going into an exam. Again, going back to checklists and checking what they've revised, maybe using a checklist to sort of group together topics so they know which ones are applicable to which exams. And then using past papers and practice papers. So lots of staff will have been providing students with those either through Satchel or online, or hard copies in school as well. So using those past papers and actually familiarising themselves, having a go at papers is a really good way of sort of final way of revising. Certainly students should use model answers that staff have provided. Certainly they should use writing frames or sort of how to answer type guide, so they know how to answer a 20-mark question or a 10-mark question in any given subject, because they do differ between subjects. And then finally, checking answers at the end. Having that mark scheme and working out, well, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? What do I need to do a little bit more work on? So that's a really useful sort of phase of revision, probably towards the end, and probably more so in the summer when we're getting ready to take exams. So those are the 5 areas to talk to students about. Hopefully that's really helpful to know how to support students from home as well. A final couple of slides that I'm going to show that I didn't share with students is just slightly more general and some extra information should you need it. So extra things is worth thinking about where students are studying at home. Is it away from distractions like mobile phones and TV and games and so on? Is it somewhere quiet and calm that they can revise? And actually having somewhere separate that allows them to have nice times and sort of food and socialise and so on somewhere else, and somewhere separate to do their work so they can separate the two. Certainly revision timetables, as I said, can be really helpful to make sure that we're sort of keeping on track. Again, thinking carefully about what we know already. Definitely going for different types of activities, and not just doing flashcards for absolutely everything, and actually experimenting with different techniques, trying out some mind maps or some mnemonics or some acronyms or some diagrams, and working out which sorts of activities work for specific students. Definitely going back to those lists again and checking how we're getting on. There is also something really sort of therapeutic, rewarding about ticking things on a list. I'm sure we all feel that. And actually having those PLCs, those content lists, and ticking off when things are revised or when things are covered, that's a really important part to keep that motivation, keep that momentum going through. And then obviously from that we can work out, well, what else do I need to know? What are the areas that I still need to do more work on? I'll also flash up a slide. I won't talk through all of these, but on there are lots of other tips that are hopefully helpful. Things around sleep and nutrition, social media, self-talk and being positive, and so on and so on. So that's probably a useful list to pause on and just think about, what can I do to help my son or my daughter to get those conditions just right for them. And then finally, there are some extra links on this slide, which is obviously also on the presentation along with this recording, for various areas. So if you want some more ideas or more tips about some of those areas, please do click on those links to get a bit more information. I hope that's been helpful. The whole idea is that school and student and family at home should be working together to try and support that young person. So hopefully those ideas are helpful, and it's given you a better idea of what we're talking to students about in school.